We see the charts, don't we, with all the flags. This is where all the workforce come from. But when it comes to something like crime, tell us the makeup of this. Tell us, where people are coming from. They say there's absolutely no reason for you to have that information.
The stunt is everything. The retweets are everything. There's a certain type of activist who does, in this case, quite literally kind of taking a holiday in someone else's misery.
Who's left behind in a New York or an LA? The young lunatic hipsters who feel they can indulge their emotions.
Hello and welcome to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, thrilled to be joined as ever by Spike's editor Tom Slater.
Hello.
And one of our favourite returning guests, trade unionist Paul Embery.
Hello.
Got loads to talk about today. We'll be looking at Los Angeles in flames, the Ballymena riots and Greta's flotilla. So Los Angeles has been engulfed in rioting for almost a week at the time we're recording this. Protests against Trump's immigration policies have turned violent. Trump has sent in the National Guard, even the Marines, to try and restore order. But this has been against the express wishes of LA's mayor and California's state governor.
We are going to fight for all Angelenos, regardless of when they got here, whether they have papers or not. We are a city of immigrants.
To talk about this, I'm joined by Spiked columnist Joel Kotkin, who is in California right now. Joel, could you give us a bit of a picture of how things are going down there? How serious has this got?
Well, as somebody who's lived in Southern California for a half century, I've experienced lots of riots. This is nothing on the scale of 1992, and I wasn't here in 65, but that was also pretty terrible. That was what's known as the Watts riots. Those were conflagrations where massive groups of people went in, they looted stores, and it was all over the city. I mean, there was not, there were areas that weren't hit, but there were many that were. I remember sitting on my porch and when I was living at that time in the Hollywood Hills and looking out, and you could see the fires in the distance. I don't think it's the same. This seems to be much more political, much more if you will, pre-planned. There had already been freeway shutdowns well before this. And that, I think, is what's different. I think that the Rodney King riots, which I did cover, were very different. They were, I'm sure there were agitators, but there was a spontaneous rise. There were 1 million undocumented in Los Angeles County, 1 million, okay? Out of close to 10 million people. I think very few of them went out. First of all, if I'm undocumented, the last thing I want to do is protest the ICE who could arrest me and deport me. I mean, why would I do that?
Yeah.
Remember the people who rioted, particularly in 65 and large extent 92, were legal residents, African Americans whose families had been here longer than most white people's families have been here. So, it was a different dynamic. But to say the city itself is not engulfed in riots, but there are certain parts. The other thing I think is really important is that there has been a culture of lawlessness in central Los Angeles that has been developed certainly since 2020, that you read about drivers being stopped by gangs of kids. You have people smash and grab robberies. I mean, these things are happening on a regular basis. Now, the only good news is that there's now a new DA and district attorney, and that actually some people may actually go to jail. Under Gascon, I mean, you could do anything you want and nothing was going to happen.
And if this is perhaps, say, fringe of radical politics, for instance, rather than a mass spontaneous uprising against Trump or against these policies, why do you think the Democrats are so keen to back it? It seems as if they're at least making excuses for it, downplaying some of the violence, or suggesting that Trump is what's provoked it, with him bringing the National Guard. Why are they making excuses for this?
I think it's the nature of what the Democratic Party has become. I mean, people talk very often. I've spoken quite a bit with Jennifer Hernandez, attorney, also a long-term Democrat as I was. It's the groups. It's and the problem is, one George Soros and one guy out of Shanghai can finance this stuff. It doesn't take. But what will $20 million do in terms of paying for agitation? As long as there are the useful idiots to pay for it. So the problem is the Democrats have this as part of their infrastructure. I mean, in other words, it's the same nonprofits who would back Kamala Harris also would back, the Palestinian encampments on college campuses. I mean, it's almost as if it's the same people. I can tell you one thing because I've seen this up front myself. There was a move by the Santa Ana, where my synagogue is, the Santa Ana City Council to pass an anti-Israel resolution, and there were a group of people who were extraordinarily well organized, who went to that. And when I would show them show pictures. And my friend, oh yeah, they're the same people come to this. Otherwise, there's a cadre. I don't know if you have that in Britain, where there's a cadre of people and they move from cause to cause, and they're willing to do almost anything. And the problem is that now is coterminous with a large part of the Democratic Party funding base. The other thing that's very important in this case, and is probably in some ways something that should keep the business community awake at night, is the rise of what are really quite openly anti-capitalist forces, and how they're tied in as well. I mean, I always wonder why a guy like George Soros, whose money is it comes from currency manipulation, is against capitalism, but maybe, it's sort of like if you have a nice house in a nice neighborhood, you don't want anyone to move next to you. So maybe he wants to be the last rich man in America. But it's really psychotic. I mean, that's the only words I can say. I mean, there's just there seems to be no idea that more than anything else, and I'm not saying it's a good thing. People want security and safety before absolutely everything else. I mean, unless you're going in and the Gestapo is coming in at 2 a.m. to arrest you, you're really, really more concerned about the fact that, for instance, why would I ever go to downtown Los Angeles? Why would I want to risk myself? That's the thing. I feel like looking at these, business leaders who are sometimes big Democratic donors. I say, I wouldn't invest in downtown real estate right now. I think it's probably not someplace you want to live. So and this is what's also driving the national politics, because as the Democrats seem to embrace chaos and lawlessness, people say, okay, I'm going to go to some place where that doesn't happen.
Yeah. And it just seems, looking at some of the images coming out of here, that the main beneficiary of all this is going to be Trump. You see the chaos, of course, the people waving the Mexican flag. There doesn't seem to be any sense of the risks of any of this behavior for the movement. But are there also potentially, on the other side, are there risks for Trump as well? What could things potentially go wrong for him out of this?
Well, first of all, I mean, Trump is his own worst enemy, always has been. If he had, for instance, if he had come in on the immigration issue, said the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to arrest the criminals, and get rid of them, there'd be 90% support. Now, the radical wing of the Democratic Party would oppose it, but instead there's going and inevitably arresting some nice guy with a family of 4 who live next door to you, who works in a car wash. That's not going to be particularly popular. And the fact that he could have reached out and said, hey, look, we're going to pass DACA, which was to legalize the children of undocumented who had grown up in this country. I mean, he could have gone halfway. He's incapable of doing that. I mean, we seem to have sort of like sort of maybe it's proper for the digital age. We have a 0-1 uh, uh, situation. We have two opposites. I think Trump still has, the support, particularly on this issue, about 60% of the population, maybe more. But on other issues, he doesn't. And, he's such an unappealing character. If the Democrats could have a face that is, John Fetterman, Josh Shapiro, Andy Beshear, Dan Lurie, the new mayor of San Francisco, I think that they would win. I think a decent, middle of the road, competent, law-abiding Democrat would kick Trump's ass, and he would, and J.D. Vance's ass even further. But if they nominate AOC, which almost, which is almost beyond comprehension, I think they'll lose.
And finally, I mean, you've alluded to this earlier, but these riots are really a symptom of a broader problem in the sort of progressive, democratic-run cities. I mean, there's not a lack of money in Los Angeles, not a lack of government spending, but clearly something has clearly gone wrong where this kind of lawlessness is merely the tip of the iceberg. Actually, the norm is for there to be huge amounts of crime and disorder and squalor. What do you make of that?
Well, I think that this is the trajectory of almost all the democratic cities, and at the same time, what's really interesting is the elites, particularly, let's say in New York, they're buying property. The cities, the group that's really leaving the cities is the middle class and the upwardly mobile working class. And by the way, that in a place like Los Angeles or New York tends to be, African American, Asian, or Hispanic, not predominantly white. So, I think what they're doing is they're undermining the very places they govern. I mean, when we had the LA riots, the next year we elected a Republican mayor, and who served 2 terms, was very popular. If you don't respond, he came in, say, I'm going to reimpose law and order, and he did, and it was extraordinarily popular, particularly among Hispanics. The problem I see happening is that people are mobile. This isn't China or the Soviet Union where, I'm going to move to Tennessee and I have to apply for a permit. People just move, and they vote with their feet. They move to the suburbs. I mean, I notice here in Orange County where I live, lots of Asians and Hispanics have moved here from LA for precisely these reasons. So what happens is, who's left behind in a New York or in LA? The young lunatic hipsters who don't have kids, don't own anything, and feel they can indulge their emotions to the extreme. The very poor and the people who work for the government. That's what's left. And then there's a group of rich people who are able to insulate themselves through private security. And I think this may be the fate of all great cities in the Western world, including London and including Paris. My wife's family's from Paris, and you go there and it's got a creepy New York's 1970s vibe, which I never expected to see there. So we ought to look at the LA thing as not just LA, but something that's happening to urban centers around the world.
So there's been 3 days now of unrest in Ballymena in Northern Ireland, triggered seemingly by an alleged sexual assault, sparked a huge anti-migrant backlash. Many people of foreign birth have been targeted. Cars have been set on fire. People's houses vandalised. Tom, what have you made of this unrest? I mean, this is not the first anti-migration riot on the island of Ireland, and not even in the United Kingdom in recent years.
No, absolutely. And it's one of those things where, first and foremost, there is the horrific scenes that we've seen on the streets themselves. As you say, the rioting, the burning down of homes, leisure centres, throwing masonry, burning barricades and so on. Something that's kind of spilled over from an original kind of peaceful protest, which gets hijacked by people who want to cause trouble. Horrific scenes of people being kind of targeted, burnt out of their houses, even though they had absolutely nothing to do with the horrendous crime that actually sparked this. You know, even the heartbreaking images of the sort of local Filipino community putting signs up in their windows saying Filipinos live here, to try and move the mob over from their particular street, as you say, was also sparked by a horrific alleged crime that we should also note and talk about. There's not a hell of a lot that we can say, but nevertheless, two 14-year-old boys, seemingly of Romanian Roma background, who all we know so far about them is that they are alleged to have committed this very serious sexual assault against a teenage girl, and that they have entered their pleas via a Romanian interpreter. And it's one of those things where at moments like this, because there has been a repeated pattern, which I'm sure we'll get into, clearly kind of condemning the violence and the racism where it has been expressed is obviously morally essential, but also kind of insufficient, because of the fact that we have seen, whilst the nature of County Antrim has its own kind of particularity, shall we say, this is also a story that we've seen repeat itself, not just across the island of Ireland, but the UK. You think about the Knowsley riots outside that migrant hotel back in 2023, where you had a very similar situation, a quite impoverished community that had experienced a lot of inward migration, in that case bearing the brunt of a lot of the asylum claims in that particular hotel. You have an alleged crime, in that case a alleged on-street grooming of a young girl, which becomes the spark for a protest, which then gets hijacked and so on. Of course, we saw it in Dublin in 2023 as well. We saw it across the country last summer, and they're just the conversation cannot begin and end with condemning the horrendous behaviour that we've seen. You need to look at more broadly what has taken place, and it does feel like across the country, particularly in deindustrialised places which have seen huge amounts of inward migration, not much attention paid to integration. It seems like you kind of, in so many places, the failure of policy has created, if you wanted to create the kind of the atmosphere in which resentments could get out of hand, or that problems could arise like this, that you could have really horrific clashes, these are the kinds of policy failures that you would preside over. So I think we just need to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time where these things are concerned. And yet it seems where the politicians are speaking about this, it begins and ends with just condemning the violence. That's clearly not enough. We want to get to the roots of what's been actually going on here.
And Paul, it often seems when there's an incident like the one we're talking about that sparks these kinds of events, there is always a tendency on the part of the establishment to downplay that there are any problems. And actually, it's all, people are only ever racist. It stems from their own bigotry. There are no issues to be dealt with. Obviously, as Tom says, we condemn utterly the violence, especially racist violence. But people can't even, it's as if to say these people are, ignored is a bit of an understatement in a way.
Yeah, and some of the scenes have been genuinely harrowing. Seeing people set light to the property of people who are almost certainly entirely innocent, and doing so because they think those people have come from a particular community and therefore a fair game to be targeted. You can't condemn that strongly enough.
Yeah.
And frankly, some of the louts who have been responsible for that deserve to go to jail for a very long time, in my opinion. Behind that, and it's a little bit similar, I think, to Southport as well, that, on the front line were some undesirable people who deserve to go to jail, no question. But behind that, there's also a large body of people who may not have been committing the violence, but are just maybe standing there to protest, to make their feelings known. Who are expressing, what is, I think, a growing resentment in Ballymena and post Southport and elsewhere in our country. Some of those tensions are real. Some of those tensions are genuine, and the people who are voicing their unease about what's going on in our country and are not turning to violence do deserve to be listened to. And I think that by and large, these are people who have, for a number of years now, have been crying out about the impact of globalization in their communities, the impact of deindustrialization, as Tom said, in their communities, particularly the impacts of mass immigration in their communities, the promotion by successive governments of state-sponsored multiculturalism, a hard multiculturalism, which I think has divided and fragmented communities. What people, I think, see as an asymmetrical multiculturalism, as some people have started calling it, where they think constantly, we have to be inclusive and welcoming and celebrate other people's cultures, but any expression of, the indigenous culture, if you like, is supposed to be downplayed and suppressed because that's something that we shouldn't encourage. And people are not stupid. People sense that is what's happening. They sense that it's not happening just in their own communities. They sense that it's happening elsewhere around Britain. And people have time and again voted to challenge, to push back against this. Did it with Brexit. They did it in the 2019 general election, where they've said time and again, enough is enough. We need a change to the approach, particularly the sort of loose immigration policy, which is having such an impact. And time and again, they've been ignored. And I always say that, the ballot box is a safety valve. And if people feel that they cannot get change through the ballot box, and they must be coming to that view now in some of these communities, and they're justified probably in coming to that view, then don't be surprised if they take to the streets and say, we're now going to have to try unconventional methods because you lot in power are not listening to us. Notwithstanding all of that, we need to condemn some of what has gone on 100%.
Definitely. And Tom, one of the other safety valves is free speech. Again, this is a subject that it's risky to talk about, let alone protest about.
No, absolutely. And it's one of those things where whether it's the clamp down on people talking about these issues or whether it's actually the amount of information that is allowed to eke out, you see a similar caginess on the part of the authorities as well as the media. I mean, if you were looking at the BBC, you would often have to click through quite a few number of articles and kind of read between the lines to work out what the crime, the alleged crime, we should say, that sparked all of this was, what the profile of the alleged perpetrators were, the fact that the BBC News story that actually referenced the fact that they've been brought in and entered their pleas, even quite euphemistically, just referred to them as they entered they gave them their names and their details through a Romanian interpreter. So again, even there's a kind of nervousness, and I think this is a real problem. It's something that we've seen repeated time and time again, which is because the state and because the media essentially think that the more information you give to people, the more likely they are to fly off the handle. You create these information vacuums which get filled sometimes by people who are genuinely trying to push things in a more explicitly racist, anti-migrant, violent direction. You saw that after Southport, obviously. You saw that in the wake of what happened here. You saw that in Dublin as well, where there's going to be the more it creates precisely the opposite of what the authorities and the powers that be want to bring about. It actually inflames things. It allows the conversation to be hijacked, and that's actually also kind of broader stories. What's happened with the immigration discussion more generally? The fact that to the extent that the mainstream did touch it, it was in a very kind of cursory way, and no one really believed that the political parties were actually that bothered by it or that affected by it. You create a situation in which to have some of these difficult conversations, people found themselves gravitating towards sections of the online right where you absolutely could talk about this issue, and it was actually being talked about in a way that was purposely inflammatory and with its own set of bigoted agendas attached to it. So as ever, like the answer to all of this is more open discussion, taking people's views more seriously, allowing that safety valve of democracy or free speech or whatever. But we're lumbered with politicians who actually think that's the most dangerous thing you could possibly do.
And similar to the elite's resistance to the idea that that there should be the release of information regarding crimes by foreign nationals and which particular country they come from. And there was huge resistance to that. And you saw when Yvette Cooper, I think it was, eventually said, yes, we will provide this information. You saw all of these kind of liberal voices on social media saying how terrible it was that this information is being provided to the public. And it's rank hypocrisy, actually, because these are the same people who will, when it comes to, for example, foreign nationals working in the National Health Service, people who have come here from abroad to work in the National Health Service, and we're constantly told, we should celebrate this, and we see the charts, don't we, with all the flags. This is where all the workforce come from. And you think, okay, yeah, fair enough. I mean, we do need a debate about whether it's right to strip those countries of their important medical resources, doctors and nurses and so on. But they're quite happy to give us that information. But when it comes to something like crime, when we ask for the same thing, okay, well now tell us the makeup of this, tell us where people are coming from. They say there's absolutely no reason for you to have that information. And the problem is that's when the conspiracy theories then start. That's when people say, well, if we can't rely on the mainstream media to provide this information, if they go to such lengths to stop us knowing, about the suspects in the Ballymena case, then actually, why should we believe them on anything? So in many respects, I think those people at the top, the elites, are making a rod for their own backs on this stuff.
And it's feeding that which you're starting to see creeping around the edges, a very kind of explicit sort of white victimhood, sort of far right politics, which is being curdled. And it's very much in response to this idea. It was like, oh, when it's a white guy who commits a crime, you're going to tell him, what his background was. But when it's someone from a different background, because you don't trust us, you're going to go down this route. Again, it's like everything they do to try and assuage what they see as the situation, to try and calm things down, they only end up inflaming things or handing a boost and a fillip to the people who you really don't want to be handing that boost or that fillip to. So, but they just keep doing this time and time again, because ultimately they don't trust the public. They think that a riot is what happens when you allow people to, speak their minds.
And they think people are stupid. They think people are not going to realise this is what you're doing to us. You're clearly, we're reading these stories and you're clearly withholding this information as if people are not going to suss that out and perhaps respond to it in the way that they do sometimes.
Or even that people aren't capable of having a balanced debate, that we're able to say that, most migrants contribute and then some people are criminals. And that doesn't mean that that doesn't necessarily mean you'd go down a racist path, to just have the knowledge of what's going on. Should we talk about Greta?
Be rude not
to. Greta's aid flotilla was very sadly intercepted earlier this week. She's been deported, she's taken into Israel and has been deported back to France. Tom, what have you made of this stunt?
It's definitely a stunt. It's something which has been pretty unseemly to watch unfold, not least because of the fact that you had the stark contrast between what Greta and her fellow shipmates were saying about what was going on and actually what was going on. The idea that they had been kidnapped by the IDF when they were kind of intercepted, given a sandwich, taken back to Israel and then put on the first flight back to Europe. I know Greta doesn't like flying, so maybe that's a kind of form of torture for her to have
sort of religious, but
cracked up any air miles at all. But it was a slightly unseemly spectacle. I do genuinely think that, like, regardless of one's position on Israel and Palestine, I think this kind of activism doesn't really help anything. I don't think Greta at this point is a help to any cause that she attaches herself to. There is a certain form, particularly in the social media kind of influencer age, of people for whom the spectacle is everything, the stunt is everything, the retweets are everything, and particularly where foreign conflicts are concerned, there's a certain type of activist who does, in this case, quite literally kind of taking a holiday in someone else's misery. And I think it felt like that in many respects. So yes, the whole point was the spectacle. That's certainly been achieved, but I'm not sure anyone has come out of this any more enlightened about what the road ahead is for the people in Gaza or Israel as a consequence of all of this.
Yeah, Paul, because obviously, it's completely normal to have humanitarian concerns about people of Gaza, but there's something about the way this issue has been almost commodified. Greta, you have to wear the keffiyeh like Greta now does, or she's jumped from one cause to another. It's become almost like an obligatory fashion statement, which doesn't help anyone, I don't think. It's not good for people of Palestine.
No, I tend to, if Greta Thunberg is supporting a particular cause, I tend to support the opposite cause, just by default almost, because there's this idea. I've got nothing particularly against it personally. In some respects, I think it's a good thing that young people, do get interested and active in politics. But this idea that she's kind of imbued with this unique wisdom, which the rest of us don't share in, and therefore almost it's sort of godlike figure that we must listen to. I just think really insults people's intelligence, and it was clearly a stunt. There's no doubt about that. The whole kind of hyperbole around being kidnapped and what have you, when Tom said you've been fed sandwiches and given water. It's a strange sort of. It was the weirdest kidnapping I think I've ever seen, to be honest. But and what we shouldn't do is allow it and these sorts of stunts to distract us from the very, very real issues that continue to play out in the region and in this particular conflict. Because the truth is, there is still a huge amount of suffering going on both sides. I'm of the view that I think the Palestinians deserve better than Hamas. I think the Israelis deserve better than Netanyahu, and I think we have to try to broker some sort of ceasefire, which has to be predicated obviously on the hostages being released, absolutely. and then restart what is a very slow and painstaking business of trying to negotiate some sort of peaceful settlement, which I think is going to be built around a two-state solution. And those are the real issues. And I've been slightly disappointed at the way that this, almost similar to Ukraine and Russia, actually, this conflict has engendered such binary positions in some respects, because I think there is, similar to what we were just saying over the issue of immigration, there is a nuanced position there, which says, on the one hand, look, absolutely what Hamas did on the 7th of October was abominable, and those people who were responsible for that deserve to be held to account. But at the same time, there's an argument, and one that I share, that Israel has been disproportionate in its response. You can make that case without in any way being anti-Israeli or certainly not anti-Semitic. Just as you can make the case on behalf of Israel without believing there's a genocide going on, which I don't think there is a genocide going on. I think it's a very unpleasant and fierce conflict, but I don't agree that there's a genocide going on. But it's not helpful, this sort of thing from Greta Thunberg, in the sense that it just essentially distracts everybody from the serious business of trying to get a settlement, and that may be a long way off, but that's the only show in town when it comes to resolving this whole conflict. It's not going to be resolved by someone like Greta Thunberg doing what she did. I think, if anything, that's going to set the whole cause back.
Yeah, solved through retweets and Instagram stories.
No, absolutely. I mean, one thing that I have been struck by, and at the risk of sounding a bit too binary about this, is how so many people on the nominally pro-Palestine side find it very difficult, it seems, to do two things. One of which is to kind of accept that there was victims, and many of them, on the Israeli side on October the 7th. Like, even the kind of odd sort of eye roll that you sometimes get. And I think you saw a bit of that insofar as the people on this flotilla refusing to, or all of them refusing, I think is interesting to watch the footage that's been put together of the atrocities on that particular day.
The Dawn French moment.
The Dawn French moment, which on another day we might have talked about, might have devoted a segment to.
Bottom line is no. Yeah, but, they did a bad thing to us. I mean, yeah, but no. But we want that land, and we don't know, what history, and we've got, no.
There's also the extent to which even just sort of saying exactly as you did, Paul, that the people of Palestine deserve better than Hamas. I mean, it seems like there's not a pro-Palestine demonstration doesn't take place in London, which Peter Tatchell shows up to with one placard condemning Hamas, one placard condemning Netanyahu, and he's basically run out of the demonstration. That's a really kind of... I just, it's a telling and I think distorted way that has kind of taken hold, particularly amongst, to be perfectly frank, the kind of Johnny-come-latelys to this cause, of which there have been many. The way in which it has become, for lack of a better phrase, the current thing amongst a certain type of, supposed left-winger activist, the fact that people have moved seamlessly from climate to Palestine, and it's not just Greta as well. I mean, Just Stop Oil basically shut up shop and became a pro-Palestine group, essentially in the form of one of these new kind of disruptive troops that have set themselves up. And I think
youth demand. Yeah,
exactly. It's one of those things where it's striking, just the inability to do either of those two things, which is to accept that October the 7th was horrendous and did happen, and also to admit that Hamas might not be totally on the up and up. It's like they can't quite digest it if it's not a really simplistic story of good versus evil from where they're concerned.
Thank you so much for watching the Spiked podcast. We'll be back at the same time next week. In the meantime, why not subscribe to Spike's YouTube channel and then click the bell so you're always alerted whenever there's some new content. Spiked is producing more videos than ever, from podcasts like this one to interviews to our series of polemics. You really, really don't want to miss out on it. Plus, to get your daily dose of Spiked, just go to spiked-online.com. That's our website at spiked-online.com.